After almost every major organizational failure, there is a post-mortem. A meeting, a report, sometimes a formal investigation, a structured attempt to answer the question, what happened, and why. Post-mortems are, by a wide margin, one of the most universally endorsed practices in organizational management. Nearly every framework for organizational learning includes some version of conduct a post-mortem after every significant project, success, or failure. The logic is unimpeachable. If you don't analyze what happened, you can't learn from it. And yet, the same kinds of failures recur across different organizations, across different decades, with a consistency that should be surprising if post-mortems were doing what they're supposed to do. Companies that conducted thorough post-mortems after a product failure go on to make structurally similar mistakes in their next product. Organizations that documented, in detail, the communication breakdowns that contributed to a crisis go on to have the same communication breakdowns in the next crisis. This episode is about a specific and well-documented reason why post-mortems consistently fail to prevent recurrence. Not because the people conducting them are careless, but because the post-mortem process itself has a structural blind spot that operates regardless of how carefully it's executed. The blind spot is this: post-mortems are very good at identifying what happened. They are systematically bad at identifying what didn't happen. The actions that weren't taken, the questions that weren't asked, the people who weren't in the room. And in most organizational failures, the absence is at least as important as the presence. The standard post-mortem format, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? What will we do differently, has a built-in orientation toward events. Things that happened, decisions that were made, actions that were taken. This orientation is natural, because events are what's documented. There's an email, a meeting record, a decision log. The post-mortem traces the documented sequence of events and identifies the points where a different decision would have changed the outcome. What this format struggles to capture is everything that never generated documentation because it never happened. The concern that was never raised because the person who had it had learned, through prior experience, that raising it wasn't worth the cost. The meeting that didn't happen because nobody thought to schedule it. The person who wasn't consulted because the org chart didn't include them in this kind of decision. The question that nobody asked because the framing of the problem made it seem irrelevant. None of these absences appear in any document. There's no email about the meeting that didn't happen. The org chart doesn't flag the person who should have been consulted, but wasn't. It simply doesn't include them, which looks, from the org chart's perspective, like nothing unusual at all. A post-mortem that traces documented events will, by construction, never surface these absences because there's nothing to trace. The post-mortem can identify that the team didn't anticipate X, but struggles to identify why the team's process made anticipating X structurally unlikely, because the process that should have surfaced X left no trace of its absence. Have you ever been in a post-mortem where everyone agreed on what happened, but the actual fix, the thing that would prevent recurrence, required noticing something that hadn't happened, and that conversation never quite occurred? Leave a comment. Toyota's production system includes a technique called the 5 whys. When a problem occurs, ask why 5 times in succession, with each answer prompting the next why, to move from the symptom to the root cause. The technique is widely cited and widely implemented. It is also, in most implementations, applied to events. Why did the machine break? Why wasn't it maintained? Why was maintenance skipped? And so on. A chain of documented events leading to a documented cause. The way Toyota originally intended the technique to function included a dimension that gets lost in most adaptations. The 5 whys process is supposed to surface not just the chain of events that occurred, but the gaps in the system that allowed the chain to occur without intervention. The 5th why is supposed to arrive not at the person made a mistake, but at the system made this kind of mistake possible, likely, or undetectable until it was too late. The distinction is subtle, but consequential. The person made a mistake is an event-based conclusion. It identifies what happened. The system made this mistake undetectable until it was too late is a structural conclusion. It identifies what didn't happen that should have, and why the system's design made that absence likely. Most post-mortems, even ones that explicitly use the 5 whys framework, terminate at the event-based conclusion. They identify the mistake. They sometimes identify the immediate cause of the mistake. They rarely arrive at the structural reason why the system didn't catch the mistake before it became consequential, because that requires analyzing an absence. And absences are much harder to analyze than events. If the specific mechanics of why a widely endorsed practice consistently underperforms its own logic is the kind of analysis you come here for, the like is the direct signal. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's report on the 2003 Space Shuttle disaster is, by the standards of corporate postmortems, exceptionally thorough, and it explicitly grapples with this problem in a way that most corporate postmortems don't. The report doesn't just trace the sequence of events that led to the foam strike and the subsequent failure. It examines the organizational culture that had, over the 17 years between Challenger and Columbia, normalized the specific kind of risk that ultimately caused the second disaster. It asks not just what happened in the days before launch, but what about NASA's structure made it likely that a concern raised by engineers would be processed in a way that didn't result in action even after the organization had, ostensibly, learned from Challenger. The report's most uncomfortable finding is that NASA had, after Challenger, implemented numerous changes specifically designed to prevent the kind of organizational failure that caused that disaster, and that those changes, while real, did not prevent a structurally similar failure 17 years later, because the new processes were implemented within an organizational culture that hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. This is the absence that most post-mortems can't capture. Not, we didn't have a process for this, but we had a process for this, and the process existed within a culture that didn't actually use it the way the process assumed it would be used. The 7 crew members who died on Columbia were operating within a system that had, on paper, learned from the deaths of the 7 crew members on Challenger 17 years earlier. The paper learning was real. The cultural learning, the thing that would have made the paper processes actually function as intended, had not occurred. And no post-mortem of Challenger had been structured in a way that could have identified that gap, because the gap was, by definition, not yet visible at the time Challenger was being analyzed. The practical response to this problem is not do better post-mortems in some generic sense. It's a specific addition to the post-mortem process that most organizations don't include. In addition to tracing the sequence of events that occurred, an effective post-mortem should explicitly attempt to identify the sequence of events that should have occurred but didn't, and then ask, separately, why each of those non-events didn't happen. Not, what mistake did someone make, but, what conversation should have happened that didn't, what person should have been consulted who wasn't, what question should have been asked that wasn't, and what about our current structure makes each of those absences likely to recur, regardless of what we change about the specific events. This is harder than tracing documented events, because it requires people in the post-mortem to imagine a counterfactual process. What would the ideal version of this have looked like? And then identify the specific structural reasons why the actual process diverged from that counterfactual. It requires admitting that the gap between the ideal and the actual isn't a one-time failure, but a structural feature of how the organization currently operates, which is uncomfortable in a way that, we made a mistake, here's the fix, is not. The Columbia investigation's most lasting contribution wasn't its analysis of the foam strike. It was its explicit finding that organizations can implement extensive changes in response to one disaster and remain vulnerable to a structurally similar disaster, because the changes address the events of the first disaster without addressing the cultural conditions that made those events and their absence of effective response likely in the first place. The next episode looks at a specific moment that recurs across many of the cases this channel has examined, the point where a plan stops being a plan and becomes something else, often without anyone in the organization noticing the transition as it happens. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical Stoicism.